Was Jesus a rebel? Was he an iconoclast, someone who attacks revered institutions or beliefs? Certainly he is presented in such a way, especially in the gospel called John. But John was written long after the ministry of the pre-Paschal Jesus. While Christians today may believe that John is all true, they need not necessarily hold that the gospel is all factual. Alone among cultures, our modern Western world has a problem distinguishing truth from facts. But all the Gospels do report considerable conflict going on between Jesus and the temple authorities and their representatives. It is well established that the peasant artisan turned folk healer, Jesus, of Nazareth, was constantly criticized by the authorities, that is, the urban elite, these folks up here in the smokestack. Why? The elites criticized Jesus because he broke nearly all the purity rules of what modern anthropologists call the Great Tradition. What is the Great Tradition? In the Gospel called Mark, it gets called the Tradition of the Elders. It was a system of Israelite practices intended to be pleasing to God, mostly maintained, defined, and practiced by small elite groups in first-century Israelite towns, these being composed of, notably, the Pharisees and their scholars called scribes. In order to please God, these minority groups expected and demanded that every Israelite must practice this same way. Since Galilean peasant day laborers were unwashed according to this view, they were outside the law and could not hope to please God. Consider peasant farmers and scarcity of water. Maybe peasants living in this semi-arid region did not have enough water required for ritual cleansings. As they grappled to survive planting and plowing away, maybe they could not postpone their subsistence work for holy observances. Could such people actually keep these purity laws of the Great Tradition? It was nearly impossible. And consider other peasant day laborers, Galilean fishermen. Weren't they always coming into contact with dead fish, dead animals, and other unclean things? And consider peasant travelers like Jesus and his disciples, who were always traveling about the countryside. Such people were thought to be, by the ancients, social deviants. How could such travelers maintain ritual purity so far from home? That was almost impossible to do. Therefore, the rural peasants had to follow a little tradition, which had significantly been adapted to the harsh realities of peasant life. Again and again, the mark in Jesus violates the purity rules regarding persons. The mark in Jesus comes into physical contact with the sick. He touches the dead. He touches those with physical defects. He touches those possessed by demons. The mark in Jesus violates rules about the body. He disregards rules about practices and customs of meals. He breaks the rules about sacred times. And he breaks the rules about sacred places. Should we be surprised, then, that in the raging controversy about the source of Jesus' power in the Gospels, his opponents make the claim that Jesus' rule-breaking comes from Satan? Such comments about Jesus breaking the purity rules are both important and familiar. But a critical fact about ancient peasant life often gets missed. It is true that the historical Jesus lifestyle may have indeed seemed unholy and unwashed by the religious elite. It is true that these elites may have deemed his behavior as iconoclastic, or even worse, perverse. But to his fellow peasants, in this regard at least, Jesus would not have seemed special, weird, or out of the ordinary. For Galilean peasants, the behavior and lifestyle of Jesus was nothing out of the ordinary. Even if they wanted to, only a very tiny percentage of peasants could maintain the great tradition. Was it bizarre or special that Jesus touched dead bodies? Not to his fellow peasants. They were always touching corpses. Physical contact with bodily secretions, dead animals, and unwashed food were regular and routine occurrences for Galilean peasants. And so what if Jesus didn't follow Sabbath rules? His fellow peasants did not follow the Sabbath rules themselves. Consider the marginal or uneven rainfall and the plight of these starving dryland farming peasants. Say one skips a day of working in the fields in order to keep the Sabbath and holy days. Well, such a peasant could expect lower final yields come harvest time. Could peasants like Jesus afford the prescribed sacrifices? Not always, and definitely not often. How well do you think that Galilean peasants like Jesus could guarantee their own ritual cleanliness or the cleanliness of their meal companions? So, was Jesus really a rebel? Was the pre-Paschal Jesus an iconoclast? Folks, Jesus the iconoclast got created by elites in their elite outlook on life. Illiterate peasants did not think of Jesus that way. They didn't think of him as a rebel or an iconoclast. So, whenever in the Gospels we see Jesus being celebrated as an iconoclast or being condemned as a rebel, we can be sure that this reflects a time after the pre-Paschal Jesus. Jesus the iconoclast originates in the literate stage of the Jesus tradition, the written Gospels. Remember that unlike Jesus and his immediate followers, peasants, the evangelists could write, which means they likely belong to only 1 to 2% of the total population. Whether you celebrate Jesus as rule breaker or condemn Jesus for being such, your viewpoint is not a peasant one, but that of the elite. To such an elite perspective, Jesus is indeed a rule breaker, for good or ill. But say you identify rather with the peasant way of life, then to you, Jesus is simply an ordinary person in this regard. Peasants had the most difficulty keeping the rules having to do with dietary laws, with washing, with Sabbath observance, and temple sacrifice. These are precisely the rules that the peasant Jesus broke. In every respect, the lifestyle of Jesus would have been familiar to his fellow peasants. Of course, Jesus' fellow peasants would have been surprised by his defense of an internal holiness before God that could be maintained without heavy expense or without the disruption of necessary peasant farming practice. They would have been surprised by that. But his lifestyle would not have surprised them. So what is really being provided in the gospel stories here? It seems likely that the Gospels provide a statement that it is possible to be holy before God within the realities of the peasant way of life. And Jesus, himself a peasant, must be the primary example. It is this astonishing yet consistent testimony in the gospel tradition that must be the origin point for making any portrait of Jesus. And Jesus ate with any and all in his society, poor and rich, elite and outcast. He could smoothly work and move deftly across the immensely rigid boundaries of his stratified cultural world. And Jesus called together a community of the people of God that crossed all these uncrossable divides. It is these two aspects which are indeed central to understanding the impact Jesus had on his followers in the Jesus movement and the beginnings of the church.